So many of you know my other work because I talk about it a lot. And this work, so my self-explanation work, my expertise work, and more recently my the IES-funded ICAP work, as well as NSF-funded and early confirmation data of the active learning work. Anyway, this line of work is presented mostly in European conferences because Europeans are very interested in conceptual change. So, as you know, learning science requires understanding the causal explanations of processes and phenomena. We're not just asking them to memorize facts. So students have trouble understanding explanations, scientific ones, because they already have this prior naive conceptions that are incorrect, robust, and persistent. But I want to stress, and I can't go into talking about now, it's not just misinformation, and it's not lacking information. The fact is that they have an alternative conception. So the point is, how can we capture what alternative conceptions these misconceptions are? So let me give you an example. And so the scientific correct conception is on the left. The first breakthrough I have when I thought about this work, which I've worked on for 22 years actually, the first idea, which took forever, is that misconception, if you have two metal bars, one's hot, one's cold, students think of the hot metal bars having, let's say, hot molecules or more hot molecules, whereas it's really it's a motion of the molecule, which is conception, the correct conception. Then you're talking about heat transfer. Again, the misconception is that the hot molecules go one direction, the cold molecule goes the other direction, and then at the end they all even out. That's the misconception. Whereas we know the correct conception is that just the motion at the speed of the molecules, and then they transfer energy. So that's the difference between correct and misconception. So many phenomena, as it turns out, in students' everyday environment are also misunderstood or misconceived. For example, like these geese flying. So if you ask how is the V pattern formed for geese, either young children or older children, they typically say there's a leader bird. Well, they might get the idea because there's a lead pilot when they look at airplanes flying with a V formation. And the same misconceptions occur for ants foraging for food, wolves hunting for prey. They look similar in that they seem to have the goal-directed behavior. They march in single file. They go toward food source and then disperse and go toward another food source as if they kind of knew what to do, as if the alpha wolf was targeting the prey. So misconception in these two examples is to treat ants foraging for food as wolf hunting for prey, or geese flying V pattern as pilots flying in V. But what is the nature of this conflict between the correct and the misconceived ideas? So typically what some scholars' misconceptions do is to describe what the correct conception is and describe what the scientific conception is. And physicists really like to do that. They make fun of Harvard undergraduates who don't understand what's going on. Anyway, but what you need to do is really understand what is the nature of this conflict, what is the misconception, how can it be characterized, how is it represented, what is the correct conception, therefore how do they conflict. Only then can you design instruction. So our approach is to characterize the nature of the correct and the misconceived explanation, show how they're different, then design instruction accordingly. So the correct explanation to the plain question that there's a lead pilot. So what is the nature of this correct conception? To characterize the explanation, the correct one, that there's a lead pilot, we're looking at the relationship between the agents, the individual plane, and the V patterns. And I've identified 5 attributes, but I'll just go through 4 of them. The pattern, the V pattern, is caused in this case by a single or perhaps a subgroup of agents, okay? Some agents, like the lead pilot, have a special role or special status. The direction of the individual agents tend to correspond or match the direction of the V pattern. The V's go this way, the agents tend to go this way. Finally, I'm just naming 4. One or more of the agents have this global goal of intentionally flying this V pattern, right? The pilot wants to fly this V pattern, so they have an intentional goal. The correct answer to the geese question is, how do you get this V pattern? Is simply that every goose flies behind another goose where there's a pocket of air of least air resistant, a pocket of least air. So what is the nature of this correct conception? The V patterns caused by each goose flying behind each other's. Therefore, the patterns caused by all the geese interacting the same way, not by a single lead goose. All the geese contribute equally, all birds have equal status, no one has a special status. Interaction of some of the yeast may not correspond to the pattern, and the V is unintentionally produced. Each individual bird simply has a local goal of flying in a pocket of least air resistance. So the V pattern is produced by the collective interaction of all the birds. Very simple. Now, if you look at compare the attribute that I've characterized for the correct explanation between the agent and the pattern, you see two diametrically opposite set of attributes. Number of agents responsible for the pattern of the case of geese, one or a subset for the case of plane. Corresponding between behavior of the agent and the pattern level. For the geese case, it doesn't have to match. For the plane, it does match, and so on and so on. The mechanism producing the pattern is a collection in the case of geese, whereas more cumulative in the case of plane. I won't explain that right now. And more importantly, the goal is more local in the geese case and global in the plane case. So they're diametrically opposite and mutually exclusive. So I will make a set of claims based on this finding. The first claim is that these two mutually exclusive set of attributes are ontologically or significantly different. They're a different schema. That's what makes conceptual change so complicated. I can't go to the details. So I will simply call these two schema an emergent schema and a sequential schema. So misconception, claim 2, is therefore conceiving of emergent processes or concept as a kind of sequential processes. So this can be seen in the misconceived attributes that students' explanation foster. So if they're to explain an emergent process, it has quality of the other attributes. So for example, ants are not told by the queen ant where to go to find food, unlike the case of the alpha wolf. So you can look at the explanation and identify attributes from the other schema. The third claim is that students are very unfamiliar with the emergent schema, and this is not only evidenced by the robust misconceptions, but also perhaps this is developmental predisposition to understand narratives and sequential events. Your entire world is sequential. You can see sequential things. And the most important claim is that many science concepts or processes taught in the middle school are actually this emergent kind of concepts. So there's absolutely no differentiation that's ever been made for students, nor instruction has ever told them about this novel schema that they are unfamiliar with. So let's take an example. In the same chapter, often, you might get things like osmosis, floating, sinking, natural selection, diffusion, heat transfer, motion resulting from forces. Those are all emergent kind of processes, along with sequential processes, circulation of blood, phases of moon, cell division, that diagram that we saw Jennifer presented, respiratory system, and so on. Those are all cyclical sequential processes. They're all often presented in the same chapter. So now I'm going to go into one example that we worked on, which is diffusion, which is introduced in the 8th grade. Suppose you ask students for this little thing, two vessels, one has ink and one has water. Why does ink appear to flow from the left jar to the right jar when you're connecting with a tube? You'll see perceptually you'll see a flow. And and they'll give you a whole bunch of reasons. They could even say that there's more ink molecules. So it's not that they can't think about molecules. It's just what is it about the molecules they think about. So one of my claims is that the macro level pattern, this is called the upper level, the pattern is called macro level pattern, are often already known, or they're somewhat familiar with it. If they analogize it to water or whatever, they can make sense out of it. They can often make the correct predictions. It's the molecular level that we often said they don't know anything about, that needs to be introduced. But what I'm talking about is the hardest part that causes misconception is the interlevel. That is, they don't understand how is it that the molecular level, the behavior on the molecular level causes this pattern that you're going to see. So it's not merely that the lower level is invisible or unfamiliar. The two levels behave in totally different way with different attributes and behavior. So they cannot explain how one causes the other. So look at the simulation. When you run the simulation on both the upper and the upper side will see the flow going from one side to the other. But the bottom side, you can actually see molecules going the opposite direction. So notice, molecule can go in the opposite direction, which means they don't match what goes on above. So at the macro level, it's directional, but at the micro level, it's non-directional. It doesn't correspond. Macro level is intentional and stops, whereas the micro level, they continue. So basically, the most fundamental problem is that students cannot explain how the macro level arises from the micro level. So what can instruction do? So one approach is to teach a schema about emergence. This provides a schema for students to assimilate new instruction about concepts that are emergent-like versus sequential. So what we did was we constructed a process module that taught 8th grade students about both emergent and sequential processes. So we used two contrasting examples in our module. Our modules is about, let's say, 6,000 words, so you get a sense of how long it is. And we gave them two examples each. Two examples, sequential processes, which is WOLFs, and building a skyscraper, which is another example someone talked about here. And an emergent process, which is fish schooling and crowding to get on a bus. So I'll just cut short and just tell you what the two condition is. There's an 8th grade students who already have been taught diffusion in 8th grade. This is a pull-out after-school testing. So basically, the two conditions are identical except for what you see in the bold. So what on the left, the experimental condition, we created this emergent module. On the right, we gave students nature of science sort of module. So nature of science is information you get in the beginning of every science textbook. In fact, they have an 8th grade, they have a 9th grade, and a 10th grade. So, I mean, that material is kind of repeated. It talks about history of science. Anyway, they're about the same length. Well, at least we equated them to be about the same length. So we're not taking up extra time in science learning. One more thing I want you to notice is that right now is that the process module talk about these everyday examples. The process module never mentioned a thing about diffusion or any other science concept, okay? The idea is for it to be generalizable. So then after they read the emergent module, there's prompts to make sure they are paying attention, understanding. They're given a diffusion text which are identical for the two cases. We've improved them. And then they're giving a macro simulation like the one I showed you earlier, the top level. And they're also giving a micro simulation of the lower molecular level, as I showed you, and we given pre-test and post-test. So what did we find? First of all, look at the blue lines. The blue line is how much, the blue bars, how much the students have learned. This is a private school. I think a very well taught private school. So in this private school, students, it's a laptop school, that's what we tried there. Their initial understanding is about 40 to 50% about diffusion. And with the control condition, they learn significantly, effect size about 0.5. But in this experimental condition, the effect size is huge. And the difference between the two effect size is also significant. So then we look at the correlation. I'm just going to show you these two results. We looked at how well students understood the module and how well they learned. So in the first row, you can see that if they learn the module very well, then there's a huge correlation significant correlation with how well they understood diffusion, but not with the nature of science. And also, if they learn the macro simulation well, there's no correlation with their understanding diffusion, as I said earlier, because the macro level information is what you're fairly familiar with, and your analogies are actually correct, whatever analogy you want to refer to. But the micro simulation, on the other hand, if you understood that well, you learn that correlates significantly as well. So the micro simulation obviously did help. So Christine asked me to talk about what did cognitive science add to this research. So conceptually, it added a way to characterize the nature of misconceived explanations and scientific explanations, instead of just describing what's the correct, what's the incorrect, concept by concept. It contributed to a way to understand why misconceptions are robust and why instruction often fail, because they're so ontologically distinct that you can't, it's difficult to just move one to the other. A third contribution from, I guess from cognitive science, although I haven't found a lot of relevant results, is we're giving a top-down instruction versus bottom-up. That is, we're teaching a generalized module that preferably can apply to many concepts. And so therefore, we're hoping to get transfer at scale. We also define, this is critical, that I couldn't talk about. We also define a list of conceptual features that allow students, and we did teach them this, allow students to discriminate an emergent process from a non-emergent one. Imagine, how do you know this is emergent, this is not, right? So there's 5 features you can actually talk about that look at how the agents interact with each other. I'll give you one example. One example is that they're all interacting at the same time, whereas in sequential process, interaction occurs over time. That's one, simultaneous. Second one is that all the interactions among the agents are uniform or the same kind. So ants, they all do let's say 2 to 3 things. They emit pheromones when they smell food, and they follow pheromones. So all ants do that. But wolves, that's not true, right? For wolves, some are alpha wolves. What they do mainly is to do the final kill. Some are disrupting. Some wolves I can't remember. Well, I mean, they make the distract them. So different wolves have different interactions, whereas for ants, they all have the same. So we basically identify 5 features for people to look at so they can discriminate them. Another contribution of cognitive science, I guess, is the idea of learning paradox. That is, Carburetor wrote about this. Learning paradox means that we basically learn by assimilating to what we already know. So if that's the case, how do you teach somebody something completely new? So the idea we used here was to use contrasting attributes. That is, if you assimilate, this is what you think you know, what's the opposite of it? And that's how we developed this new schema. And of course, our instruction aimed for transfer, and that the training module contained, as I said before, no science concept. What did cognitive science add methodologically? Well, that's pretty obvious. We borrow many ideas from cognitive science. We used contrasting examples. We used dynamic visualization. We used prompts for explanations. We used scaffolding to guide attention in the animation. Because animation, unless you guide them, they just look randomly. It turns out that didn't matter very much. Chris mentioned that either kind of prompts was good as long as you prompt them to think about it. And we designed the experiment with a very strict control condition. And there are many challenges remain, and I won't tell you what the most important one unless you ask. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So I didn't notice till after I was done designing the module. So the problem with the problem with the example I gave you, the V pattern, and the school of fish and all those stuff, the pattern is obvious. You don't need any summative mechanism, right? Oh, I see a pattern. So the problem with science concept is that you have to understand summative mechanism. So that's a real challenge. That is, how do you do a collective? I mean, when we know science, we know just sum of all this stuff. But how do you explain that to a kid that it's a summative? That's very hard. Anything else?
Since I'm on a roll.
Yeah.
So when you showed the list of these are all the sequential processes and these are all the emergent processes, maybe it scrolled by a little too quickly, but some of them seemed like there had to been in the sequential list a bunch of emergent things inside of them.
That's right. That's another complexity. Okay, that's another thing that's really confusing. So it all depends on the level you're looking at. So suppose you talk about circulatory system, you're teaching that, right? Well, circulation of blood, where does it go next? Well, that's a sequential process. But if you look at diffusion of blood between oxygen and carbon dioxide, well, that's an emergent process, right? So is very complicated, and no matter what, the way instruction is now, they're all merged together. That's it.
Why do you think it transfers so well?
Why do I think it what?
It transfers so well. Is it like knowing variability, and once you have it, you see the world in a different way, or is it something special about your instruction?
You mean, why do I think it transferred to diffusion?
Yeah. What?
Well, remember they did get, okay, so the challenges of this work is that, well, I don't know, there's that huge correlation.
Let me just.
There's a huge correlation between how well you learn the process. I was gonna say it's probably the fact that you understood the molecular level so well, but then there is this huge correlation with the process module in general.
So I'm going to give you an either or, and you're not allowed to say both.
Okay.
Is it the concept, or is it the instruction that causes it to transfer?
Is it the content, the concept?
Yeah. Is there something about the idea of emergence, which is really big and compelling, and I use it? Once I've got it, it's my hammer.
Exactly.
Or is it that you were just a great instructional strategy that would work for any topic and it would transfer just as well?
I think it's the big idea. Because instruction, number one, is identical in the two cases. I mean, there's no question that our diffusion instruction is better than your standard, probably better than standard one, because they did learn a lot. Because for example, we created diffusion text by combining the best description from 6 different texts. Okay, so we sort of cleaned it up and made it really better. And then we also presented the dynamic simulation to show everything. We prompted them to make sure they pay attention to everything. So the instruction is better, but I'm hoping that it's the big idea. So it needs a lot more follow-up work.
If there are no more questions, I think we should clear off and let the next group up. Thank you.